I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our moderator, Alan Galinsky. Alan Galinsky is the Chief Science Officer and Executive Director of Mind in the Making at the Bezos Family Foundation. She's also the Senior Research Advisor at the Society for Human Resource Management and the President of the Families and Work Institute. Alan has authored more than 100 books and reports, including the best-selling Mind in the Making, which I've asked her to talk a little bit about today. Mind in the Making, the 7 essential life skills that every child needs. Ask the Children, and the now classic, The 6 Stages of Parenthood. Mind in the Making, in conjunction with Room, that you've heard a little bit about from Jackie, is an unprecedented effort to partner with leading developmental researchers to share the science of children's learning with the general public, families, and professionals who work with them. Beyond appreciating the tremendous contributions that Alan has made for decades to the early learning field, the campaign is perhaps even more grateful that Alan has been one of our closest advisors and thought partners since even before the GLR campaign launched. Indeed, if you listen to the innovations, the ideas, the inspirations being expressed at this conference, Alan's influence is palpable. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Alan Galinsky.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's quite thrilling to be here. It's been an amazing 3 days, and I know that we're going to go forth and continue to bring about the change that each of us is now even more committed to do. With me on this panel, sitting next to me is Phil Zalazzo. You have his bio in the app that I successfully downloaded. He is one of the leading researchers on executive function skills, not only in this country but in the world, has written voluminously about them, including an incredible book now for the Department of Education on executive function skills and education. Continues to do groundbreaking work, but takes that work to action so that it doesn't just be shelf science, as Jackie called it, but makes a difference in the lives of children and adults. And next to her is Anne Fernald. Anne and I have done a back and forth between California and Denver. I went to California yesterday and was with Anne speaking to teachers, translating this science into action, and now came back last night, and she came up today to be with us. Anne's, again, from the moment I met Anne, I just went, oh, wow. This work and her personal story in creating this work helps us understand the development of language and literacy, particularly in now dual language learners, not only in the United States, but in Africa and in a variety of communities in the United States. And has also created an intervention that translates the science into action through First Five in California. Michelle Mazzocco, I don't know as well, so I can't tell the story of how I met you because it was about 5 minutes ago, except for on the phone. But her reputation is incredible in the kind of work that she's doing to understand the development of math and help kids who might not learn math as well. We all can get over "I'm not a math person" idea after we listen to Michelle. What's really critical and why we wanted her so much to be on this panel is that she is looking at the connections between math and executive function. I also think it's important that this conference is including not just looking at language and literacy, but also math because, and STEM sciences too, because I think we'll begin to see the interconnection between how we learn, which is executive function, and what we learn, the content of language. Jackie mentioned earlier that I was at the National Governors Association, as was Ralph, Sunday and Monday of this week. And if there was a drumbeat in the, among the governors at their education summit, it was early childhood. It was said again and again that the evidence is irrefutable. Former Governor Jim Hunt of North Carolina, the creator of Smart Start and so many other innovations, came up to me at consecutive times in the meeting, and he first said to me, early childhood is the most important issue in education. Then he left for a while and he came back and he said, no, it's not just the most important issue in education, it's the most important issue on the planet. And then he left a little while ago and he says, anyone who's against it is not going to heaven. So, there is an amazing opportunity here. Because it just the energy around, I've done this for a long time and I've never seen the energy around translating science into action quite as high. Why are the governors so interested in it? One word, actually 3 words: workforce, workforce, workforce. They are not getting the employees whom they need and want. And that slide was put up like 20 times at the National Governors Association. So, I've also been on a journey for 17 years, about the year that the Bezos Family Foundation was started. I set out on a question that I continue to look at answering, which is I was doing a study on what helps children thrive and looking at learning and going out, as Bob Ross was talking about, and asking the children directly. And I found them really turned off to learning, and it was very, very depressing. If you asked them to describe a moment then they were learning, they were speechless. If you asked them to describe a moment when they weren't learning, they had a lot to say. If I asked them why learning was important, they said to get good grades, go to the next grade and class, and so eventually go to college so that I won't be a bum on the street and flipping burgers. Good reasons, but what was striking me as so critical was that that fire in their eyes that babies are born with was gone. So that became my question. How do we keep the fire in children's eyes? There wasn't research at the time, but Jennifer Frederick at Connecticut College and others have documented that 40 to 60% of kids are not engaged in school. In my work in the business community, I know how critical engagement is to productivity. It leads in a very drip fashion, not just into the pipeline to jail, but also to dropping out of school, the 7,000 young people who drop out of school every year. So, but what was very striking to me at the National Governors Association is even though there's an interest in the science, it's not the science of learning. The science of learning, of how people learn, is missing. We're talking about evaluating programs, but we're not talking about that basic science that we're here to talk about with you today. So why is it so essential to understand the science of learning? I think of the research of Pat Kuhl, who shows us that in the brain, before the child begins to speak at 11 months, the Broca area of the brain is lighting up, showing that the children are rehearsing what they're going to need to do when they begin to speak. Beth Duda was saying in the session that we had at lunch, I think you're over there, I think I see your jacket, yes, you can see colors with the blinding light. She was saying that there were parents in their community who, not embarrassedly, said that they didn't talk to babies before they talked. So knowing that and seeing that image of the brain, that part of the brain lighting up, is really important. Kathy Hirsch Passuk, you may have heard of her lately if you watch the Tonys. Her son took home 6 Tonys. She let him skip sports practice and work on the theater, and he just won 6 Tonys for Dear Evan Hansen. But she's also a researcher in language, and she looked at the 30 million word gap, as have others, and showed that It's not the number of words. It's not, as Ann said yesterday, it's not just dog, 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 cat, cat, cat. It's that conversation duet, or that back and forth, or serve and return, or serve and volley, or dance as a ping pong game, as other people have called it. So what about conflict in school? People thought, just say no, or teach kids problem-solving skills. And Larry Aber has shown that that's not enough. That kids who tend to get in fights have what's called a hostile attribution bias, which means that they tend to attribute someone doing something bad to them without really having enough evidence to draw that conclusion. And if we teach children how to take the perspectives of others and understand what other people think and feel, as he did in an evaluation study, he and his colleagues, they were able to not only improve literacy, but to improve the conflict in the school. Or I think of Laura Schultz, who's found out that if we answer kids' questions too quickly, they get disinterested. The fire goes out in their eyes. We have to let kids who have questions pursue the answers themselves. We need to translate this kind of evidence into practice. Or Phil, as he'll tell you later, has found out that if we correct kids, just you're wrong and here's the right answer, without giving an opportunity to reflect on what they've learned, they're not going to have that deep kind of learning that the governors were talking so about. So the interest in executive function is so important because executive function skills develop very rapidly in the early years, also in the teen years, where I'm now working on a book. They are malleable. They're things that we can teach. And as Adele Diamond and others have found, they're more important than IQ in predicting success. I always love the study that was done in Dunedin, New Zealand, where they looked at kids' capacities very early on and found that self-control and executive function skills were more important than their IQ or their social economic background in predicting health and well-being. So it's and success in the world. So we need to pay attention to not just what children learn, but to how they learn, and that's what this panel is going to do. I'm going to, Yoli asked me to expand a little bit on what the foundation is doing, because I want to say here's to the middle people. It's not just getting directly to parents, but at the Bezos Family Foundation, we're also bringing in the echo chamber, as Bob Ross calls it, the people who work with other people. Using civic science, that is working directly with communities, we've created modules that translate this research into action. We begin with the adults. We don't begin with kids. We have them work on their own executive function skills. We bring parents and teachers together to learn it. There's a community group who learn this research together and then bring it into action in the various sectors in their community. So it really is a two-generational effort. We've adapted the modules for museums and libraries and shared those in 30 states with leaders in that field, because they are the informal education that's so important in our community. With home visiting, we're adapting the modules as well, because these people are often stressed, and if they can work on their own executive function skills, they can begin to listen more carefully to the families that they serve and be responsive. And I'm particularly excited about bringing together health and education in the work that we're doing with hospitals like Mount Sinai and NYU and others, where we are intervening with residents and teaching them developmental science and not just the health that they need to know, and building it into the scripts for well child visits. It's really very exciting. We've developed almost 100 prescriptions for learning, and they echo what Bob Ross said. They are not a punishment system. Instead of seeing kids' bad behavior as bad behavior, they're opportunities to teach life skills. It's not just fixing things for kids, but beginning to solve them for themselves. With First Book, and you heard Kyle and her team speaking earlier, we've developed a library of books and book tips, and we've just reached 500,000 book tips downloaded, free book tips downloaded, and 1 million books in our library that promote executive function skills distributed. And Jackie talked eloquently about what we're doing in Vroom, including our thrilling work in the really awful situation of the Syrian refugees. But we're developing also videos that illustrate this, because it's not enough to just have words. We're using a cinema verite approach and creating videos and texts as well. So with that, I'm going to the panel, and each person is going to spend a few minutes, beginning with Phil and going down the line, sharing your research about what you're doing, and then I have some questions for you.
Sure. So as Ellen said, executive function skills are a really important predictor of life outcomes, including academic outcomes, but continuing on through high school and college and beyond. And what we mean by executive function terms a bit more precisely is a set of attention regulation skills that allow us to control our thoughts and actions and emotions, that allow us to inhibit distractions so that we can sustain attention and attend selectively to focus. Working memory skills so that we can keep information in mind and use it to guide our behavior, and cognitive flexibility skills that allow us to think in different ways about some single thing. For example, taking another person's point of view on a situation. And these skills, as Ellen suggested, really provide a kind of foundation for learning and adaptation across a wide range of settings. They allow children to pay attention, for example, to what a teacher is saying, to remember instructions, to be able to think differently about something that they're learning new things about. And over the past couple decades, there's really been an enormous explosion of research on this topic that has deepened our understanding and led to an appreciation of the extent to which executive function skills really are skills. They are ways of using attention, and they're skills like any other skills that are learned through use, by doing. We learn by doing. And our research has focused on many different aspects of this, including, for example, how best to measure these skills. We're now able to measure them reliably and in a valid way in children as young as 2 using direct behavioral assessments. I can say more about that. And we've also taken seriously the extent to which these skills are malleable and tried to identify conditions that are conducive to the healthy development of these skills. And what we found is that effective interventions tend to encourage children to pause and to reflect before diving in and attempting to solve a problem. We can do a lot of things fairly automatically. We go through our lives to a large extent on autopilot. But when we encounter uncertainty, when we come across an obstacle, we recognize as adults that that's a situation where we need to get out of autopilot and adopt a more intentional kind of approach to addressing this situation. Those are the moments when we when we invoke our executive function skills. And so we've been training children to get in the habit of recognizing when they need to switch out of autopilot, to pause, and to rely on these developing skills for sustaining attention, keeping information in mind, thinking flexibly. We've been able to show in our research, for example, that even relatively brief interventions on the order of 40 minutes or so can lead not only to improvements in children's executive function skills, but also to improvements in other related skills. For example, perspective-taking skills, theory of mind skills. You may be familiar with that term. And we've also, in our research, been able to measure children's neural activity before the intervention and show that it changes in predictable ways as a result of reflection training. I could say more, but I think that
Okay, well, we'll go to Anne, and Anne, please share an overview of some of the things that you've been doing.
All right, sure. Ellen referred to my nonlinear career path. I'll spare you all the details, but to give you some sense of that, I have a deep-rooted interest in speech to children, the language that children hear, and increasingly in the important foundation for learning that rich and varied and abundant language to the child provides. This did not start with a fascination by Jean Piaget, whom I had never heard of at the age of 36 when I was living in Germany and working as a goldsmith. I had apprenticed in the medieval system to join the guild. I am a member of the Guild of Goldsmiths and was at the Academy of Art. But another very important thing had happened. We went to Germany for 1 year, stayed for 8. It was a quarter of my life at that point, and started a family there. And I recommend having children in another culture, right? If it's at all of interest to you, it's an amazing learning experience because things that are so, you think second nature, they're done differently, and you realize that you actually have deep beliefs and theories about what childhood is like and what parenting is like. So it was the experience of speaking to a little German baby where I was asked to be the godmother. I didn't speak German to my children, but spent a lot of time. We lived on a farm. We're immersed in German all day. And I held this little newborn, and I had this moment of self-consciousness and thought, here it comes again. I was also 8 months pregnant with our second child, so I was hormonally primed. And I leaned forward and looked, this far away without blinking and said, "Schau, nun bist du doch süß." And thought, wow, that was weird, right? Now in English, you think, no, that's how you talk to a newborn. But I'm thinking, why 2 octaves? If I were to lean over to Phil and go like that and not blink and do that to him, he would change seats immediately. It's a violation of social norms on all levels, but it fascinated me. You either got to be very close to somebody or very angry at somebody, right? Because you're going to get a response one way or the other. But that led to, and I then terminated. Well, I didn't terminate, but I left the goldsmith workshop and went and apprenticed with the director of what turned out to be the very first infant research lab in Germany, Hannes Papuschek, and volunteered to carry his equipment to the hospital since that was the only skill I had that he could use at that point. I had not studied psychology at all. And brought my own equipment on the second visit, which was a tape recorder, and tape recorded mothers speaking to me, speaking to their newborn child, and also speaking to a child who was not yet there, and did the first acoustic analysis of the melodies, the sumptuous, wonderful melodies of speech to children before they're learning language, before they know language. They're learning language very early. That then led to, I went and got a PhD eventually and came back to this country and developed experimental methods to ask the question, do babies care? Developing preference procedures. So when they hear, ja, ich weiß nicht, was denn macht. How do they feel about that compared to, ja, schau, nun bist du doch süß, right? Or in English, hey there, how you doing? And babies turn toward that side. I was working with Patricia Kuhl at that time. Babies preferred infant-directed speech. Okay, this then led to, that's meaning at a musical level, meaning at a kind of tactile, sensual, musical level, not through words, not through symbols, not through linguistic system, but just through the melody of sound. The next phase of work was to develop methods for reading babies' minds as they learn to interpret those words and those sounds. And we developed a procedure called looking while listening, and there would be a picture of a dog there and a baby there, and a little 18-month-old baby would sit on mom's lap and hear, where's the baby, right? A toddler. And at 18 months, they'd be looking, let's say, at the dog half the time by chance, where's the baby? After the word was over, some of the time they looked to the baby. By 24 months, where's the baby? By the end of the word, they were over there. By 30 months, where's the baby? They were over there. So we could measure in milliseconds reaction time. All you guys need is where's the, and you'd be out of there, right? So I'm speaking 200 words a minute right now, and you couldn't keep up with me if you didn't have that millisecond level ability to predict and make use of language as it flies by. And this processing speed measure was a behavioral measure, but it's very close to a brain measure. And it turns out to predict children's vocabulary growth. Kids get faster with age, but there are big differences in any group of children from whatever social class, at any age. So some 18-month-old children are much faster than others. We found out then that those kids who are faster at grabbing that word, the question is not, do you know the word baby? It's how quickly do you get it? How quickly does the light come on? Those children who are faster in processing speed turn out to be learning vocabulary more quickly. And that turns out also to predict how they're going to be doing 2 years later. So in the process, we had developed some very powerful new measures that captured the process of interpreting language long before children would consent to an interview or point to the picture or do anything you asked them to do, right? So it was a baby-friendly measure that gave us a powerful read on their emerging language proficiency before it had surfaced as speech, before you could test them in any other way. And it turns out that prediction is key. The ability to predict is really key. We predicted all the way out to the 3rd grade from those early measurements at 24 months. The next step was then to move to Spanish. I'm at Stanford and live in California, obviously, and very nearby. I mean, it's a huge population of Spanish-learning children. I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to do cross-linguistic work, because you know what? Spanish gives you cues that English does not. If I say, where's the, you don't know what's going to come next. But in Spanish, you've got la and you've got el. And that tells you there's going to be one thing, and it's going to have grammatical gender that could give you the cue as to which picture it is that you're looking at. That was the experiment I wanted to do. We opened a lab in the Latino neighborhood near us and found exactly the same relations between processing speed development and language growth and vocabulary growth. But we also found something else. And by the way, they can use la and l. They can take advantage of that cue. But we also found big differences between how quickly children were processing language in the English community we're testing at Stanford and across the other side of El Camino Real. And they were slower and less accurate. So obviously you can't make a comparison between what turned out to be some of the wealthiest and most highly educated English speakers in one lab and some of the poorest families in the country learning Spanish and in families that had very much lower education and income resources. So it was that discovery that we're not studying Spanish versus English, we're studying poverty versus affluence, and that's a much more important question, and it's a much harder question to get right. So we then began to look at emerging SES, that stands for socioeconomic statuses, differences. How early did they emerge? I mean, we've known for years that by age 5, and when kids enter school, there's already a 2-year so-called achievement gap that is actually an opportunity gap. But when does it begin to emerge? It doesn't just show up. Well, we traced it back to 18 months. I mean, that was as young as we could go with this, and found that by 24 months, there was already a 6-month gap in the processing skills of these between children living in disadvantaged families that happen to be Spanish-speaking, and living in advantaged families that also happened to be Spanish-speaking. So we went to Mexico City and found high-income Spanish-speaking monolingual moms. We did the same experiment in English. We couldn't find low-income families that spoke English in Palo Alto, so we went up north to Northern California to find families, and have replicated the same thing in both English and in Spanish. Okay, the important question, where do these differences come from, right? How do they emerge? And back to my interest in mother speech. We went and recorded the kind of language that these children were experiencing in the home, in everyday interactions, both in English and in Spanish. It replicates completely parallel. And found out that within both groups, whether you're low SES or high SES, there are big differences in how much language you hear. Overall, the high SES families hear a lot more. But still, there are families that are using lots and lots of words, and then there are the Google dads that are so busy Googling that they're not talking to their kids much at all. In the lower SES families, there were some families where the child heard 2,000 words an hour, and others where the child heard 60 words an hour. That's 1 word a minute. You can't learn a language easily with that kind of with that kind of input. So that has been the focus of our work for the last decade. And then comes the imperative to take these tools and take these insights and translate them into action.
So I'd love to hold that
All right.
questions
Okay.
so that we get to Michelle, and then I'd love to ask all three of you, how do you translate this research into action?
Good.
Michelle.
Well, my career trajectory is certainly not quite as varied as yours, and certainly not as geographically varied either. But I do want to start out by just mentioning that I haven't always had an interest in mathematical achievement. I'd like to tell you a little bit about where that interest came from. And part of the motivation for my interest in mathematical achievement stems from work that I did as a preschool teacher for 4 years before I started graduate school. And this really informs and guides the development of my research questions and my interest in gathering information that can really support translating research to practice and to inform caregivers and parents about ways to promote healthy learning opportunities and environments for really young children. So my initial interest in early childhood education was focused primarily on language acquisition. And I was particularly interested in how children interpret and come to understand words that have multiple meanings. So words like homonyms, how do they grapple with different uses of the word steak? You can grill a steak or you can pound it into the ground to hold up a tent. You can grow a flower or you can grind up flour for bread. How do kids grapple with multiple meanings of the same word in their preschool years when we know they are rapidly acquiring a vocabulary, but they stumble across some words that just provide some interesting potential misunderstandings and sources of confusion? And I mention this interest because it turns out that now, 20 plus years later, that work is highly relevant to my interest in children's understanding of number words. Because number words, in a sense, are very confusing, and they are very much words that take on different meanings, particularly when you consider the use of numbers across different contexts. But how I got to mathematical thinking and interest in mathematical learning difficulties was not a direct flow from my interest in lexical ambiguity or semantic acquisition. And it stemmed from some work that I was doing here in Denver many years ago as a postdoctoral fellow. I was studying learning disabilities, focused on language disabilities, but I worked with an adult population that included individuals with mathematical learning disabilities. So when I started this work, my initial image of the adult with math learning disability, at least in my mind, it was someone who was grappling with higher math. They were adults. Maybe they had difficulty with geometry or calculus or even algebra. So what I encountered instead really startled me because I encountered adults who were competent in all aspects of their life. They were employed, successful adults in the community. They were raising children. They had many skills, but their difficulty in math was predominantly in single or double-digit arithmetic. I remember a couple of these individuals remarking on how difficult subtraction was. And one woman even said to me, "I've never gotten what subtraction is. I just don't understand it." So this got me very curious about the trajectory of math learning difficulties. How do competent adults get to the point where single or double-digit arithmetic is challenging? And I started looking into the literature and discovered that aside from a little bit of literature, very good literature by David Geary and some other pioneers in math learning difficulties, there was very little understanding, very little empirical support to describe the developmental trajectory of these math difficulties. So that led me on a little detour that became a 13-year longitudinal study. It was not my intention initially. I was interested in early childhood, so I planned a K-3 study, a prospective longitudinal study looking at the emergence of math ability and disability in a relatively unscreened sample. We did not target children for high risk for math outcomes because we really wanted to look at the naturally occurring individual differences in mathematical thinking in early childhood. And what happened is that, first of all, we learned that the kindergartners who had difficulty with mathematics, not surprisingly, most of them persisted to have difficulties in mathematics through 3rd grade. So we didn't want to stop there. And so we kept getting renewals till 5th grade, and then 8th grade, and then, well, 12th grade, might as well go all the way through the K-12 span. And our study was one of several from that time period and subsequent to that time period that demonstrated that mathematical skills, particularly number knowledge and number systems knowledge at kindergarten, is a very strong predictor of the likelihood that a child would successfully achieve in mathematics by the end of high school, if they complete high school at all. So it's a very strong indicator of an area of achievement that is very, very important for a number of quality of life indicators and indicators that really drive social mobility. So we studied how the manifestation of math difficulties changed over time. So the math difficulties themselves weren't necessarily the same. It wasn't that the 12th graders were still having trouble with 2 plus 3, but they might still be very slow at generating a solution to 2 plus 3. And they might be engaging in very idiosyncratic strategies in solving problems with ratios and decimals and proportions and so forth. So we focused on whole number knowledge and found that the whole number knowledge skills were one of the strongest predictors from kindergarten to 3rd grade of which children would persistently have difficulties even in other representations of quantity and other areas of mathematics like fractions, decimals, and so forth. So this brought me back at the conclusion of that longitudinal study to focus more on those individual differences that we saw among children who were having difficulty with mathematics and those who were overcoming that difficulty, those with low achievement but that were still making significant gains over time. And so my more recent work has focused strongly on number concept development in preschool through grade 2 or 3, and focusing particular on children's understanding of number words. And I think this is a really key area to focus on because we're interested in what derails that natural progression of number word conceptual development in the preschool years, knowing that solid number concepts and solid number system knowledge in kindergarten does predict readiness to learn formal mathematics. So we've just started this work recently, and one of the things that we're finding is that children in the preschool years vary considerably in their sensitivity to the context in which number words are spoken. And so we find that some children are likely to interpret number words very literally, just like some children might interpret homonyms very literally when they don't consider the context of those number words. So quick example, and then I'll shift to wrapping these examples up. If a child is familiar with the word steak because they grew up on a ranch and to them a steak is a piece of meat you grill on Friday night for dinner, and you talk about pounding a steak into the ground to hold up a tent, that child might wrestle with the inconsistency there and reason that in this situation steak must mean something else. Well, some children, particularly preschoolers, will literally interpret that word steak in that scenario and assume that for some reason the adult is telling you they're pounding a steak into the ground to hold up a tent. A second grader won't do that. A second grader will either figure out you mean something else and use context to figure out what you are intending, or at least they'll be very confused and take a long time to generate a response to what does the steak look like. Likewise, 4-year-olds will consider the context of a situation when asked whether 4 is bigger than 2, but not all 4-year-olds do. So if I ask some 4-year-olds, Phil has 4 cookies and Anne has 2 cookies, who has more? Most of them will say Phil has more cookies. But if I ask 4-year-olds, Phil has 4 cookies and Anne has 2 boxes of cookies, who has more? Some 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and older 5-year-olds have a tendency to assume Phil has more cookies because I uttered the word 4 when enumerating the cookies that he had. But I used the number 2 to enumerate the cookies that Anne has. And so that lack of sensitivity to the context may be something that derails children's understanding of number concepts, which you can imagine would really interfere with their development of higher order number learning if that's their overall foundation.
I was going to ask you how, the connection between math and the campaign for grade level reading with its focus on reading and literacy and that sort of thing, and you've said it beautifully, that this connection is. I remember my own daughter, this is long before the days of The Apprentice, thinking you're fired meant, you're going to put fire on someone. So that kind of skill of making connections, which goes back to an executive function capacity of seeing how categories or one thing is related to another, same or different, is underlying that. I want to ask each of you to talk about translating this research into action, and then I want to ask you the connection between each of you, the connection between math and executive functions and language and literacy and executive functions, and then we're going to open it for questions. So, Phil, you want to start
Sure.
briefly about translating research into action?
The science of executive function and its development has really progressed to the point, I believe, where we know more than enough to be able to put that science into the hands of people who can benefit from it.
You're in the Bob Ross camp.
Exactly. And so we have been working hard lately to take the research that we've done, the basic scientific research in the laboratory, and translate it into interventions and programs that can help children in authentic real-world settings. We've focused on the preschool period. This is a period during which these skills normally develop very rapidly, which means that the relevant parts of the brain are adapting rapidly to structure inherent in the environment, suggesting that this is a kind of window of opportunity to change the environment and influence the development of these skills. As Ellen mentioned, the transition to adolescence is another period of relatively rapid development and presumably neural reorganization, so another window of opportunity. We've also focused on children developing executive function skills who are growing up in conditions of poverty and disadvantage. And in general, children growing up in poverty may perform worse on measures of executive function, but there's also good evidence that children who have good executive function skills and are growing up in disadvantaged circumstances seem to be protected from many of the adverse consequences of those circumstances.
Why is that?
And, well, these skills allow children to thrive and to adapt even under conditions of real challenge. So it's a kind of protective factor against the risks that downstream lead to difficulties learning, for example, in a classroom setting, acquiring language, acquiring math skills.
I want to underline that because I go to so many meetings trying to consolidate the research, and so often it's assumed that adversity is destiny.
Not at all.
Adversity is not destiny.
No, and indeed, what the research shows is that not only is executive function something that can be cultivated and promoted, but that children who are lagging behind their peers tend to benefit the most from this sort of intervention, as if there are a set of conditions that need to be in place in order to bring out these developing skills that are absent in conditions of disadvantage.
So what have you done then to promote them?
So we've done a number of things. We've worked with children in a homeless shelter to develop a 3-week program that can be embedded into the preschool on site at this homeless shelter, something called Ready, Set, Go, that provides children with opportunities to encounter challenges and identify them as such and practice paying attention, sustaining attention, ignoring distractions, keeping information in mind, thinking flexibly. And and we've found that that's very beneficial. We've done this in a number of different ways. One of the things that we learned really quickly when we started working with children in the shelter was that in addition to needing to develop executive function skills, they were experiencing signs of trauma. And so we more recently have been combining our efforts to promote reflection and train executive function skills directly with mindfulness exercises that are intended to give children some skills for managing stress and stress reactions which undermine reflection and executive function. And that combination we have explored in preschool settings, working with the KIPP schools, funded through the Character Lab. We've also been doing research in early Head Start and Head Start centers, working with parents. This is research, incidentally, that grew out of the Frontiers of Innovation and originally with funding from the Bezos Family Foundation. And we have been working with parents to work with their children, very much a two-generational sort of approach, to identify and refine routines around stressful circumstances like meal times, potentially stressful, bedtimes, transitions in general. And the idea there is it's an 8 to 10 week program in these Head Start settings where parents are introduced to the concept of executive function, why it's so important for their children's development, and indeed encouraged to work with their kids in a collaborative way to develop these healthy routines. So in other words, the parent and child are working together in a situation in which the parent can support and scaffold the development of these attention regulation skills that are so essential for solving any problem, for pursuing any goal. But in this case, we chose a goal that might lead to more stability and predictability in the context of these families.
One of the most important findings in looking at the precursors of executive function is the importance of autonomy support. And you're using that finding in not having the parent fix it for the kid. Here's a new routine and it's going to be regular, and but really helping the children have some autonomy. I think that's so important.
That's exactly right.
So Anne has done some amazing things that I've begun to have the privilege of seeing in terms of dual language learners. I'd love you to describe what you're doing.
But shall I focus on the intervention though first?
The intervention.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear
okay.
about the intervention.
That's right, yeah, because they actually all are dual language.
You what?
Yes. I've had the privilege of being involved for the last 3 years with an amazing project in Senegal. I received a provocative email message by a public health researcher working in Senegal with an NGO called Tostan, which is a Senegalese organization that's widely respected. And she described how in interviewing families, they were worried about the very high rate of school dropout in that country, where many, many children are done by the age of 8 because they just can't make it in the schools. They began to interview parents and were reading the science and had read a paper of ours about the importance of rich and abundant language, and wrote to me and said, we are interviewing parents and asking what it is that keeps them from engaging verbally with a baby, talking to a baby a lot. And the answer that you gave, which is, well, the child isn't speaking. Why should, when he talks, when he asks a question, I will answer. That's not an unreasonable hypothesis, right? The child doesn't understand anything. I'll wait until language matures, as if that's what happened. But they came up with quite different answers. I mean, they discovered that many mothers reported fearing looking at a baby like that in the eyes directly, because it might lead to spirit possession. It might make a jinn spirit jealous, and that spirit would then steal the soul of the baby, and the child would become not a human. which was very bad news for the family and the community. Also talking to babies. You might be called crazy if you did that, because as they said, no one is there. So it was such a stunning news to me. Anthropologists, of course, had been reporting this for quite a while, but I wasn't familiar with that literature. She asked, could we come and help them assess the outcomes of a program that Tostan was going to design. We had nothing to do with designing the intervention and shouldn't have had anything to do with it. Could we help them? Could we come with our wonderful lab measures, millisecond measures, and help them? They said, we've got a stopwatch here. We can hold up pictures. It'll be wonderful. And I had to say, well, you know, I'm not really a field worker, and I'm not sure these measures will work. And I demurred several times, and they said, come visit. And I did. And that was such an amazing experience that I said, I will do what I can to. And it was an extraordinary journey, working with 500 families living in villages with no roads and no water and no electricity, using lab quality measures, making all-day recordings of speech in Wolof, which is an unwritten language that is one of the national languages there. Anyway, to give you quickly the Tostan intervention was 9 months involving role play, and it was the absolute opposite of the sort of missionary approach where you march in and say, this is how you should do things. They shared the science. It was science grounded. They shared the science, and that led to long, hour-long discussions of what are the implications of this, from which then they would draw a conclusion that was in the direction of what that science was designed to show. But it wasn't prescriptive, it wasn't preachy or anything like that. Brilliantly done. They did find that mothers, after a year after the intervention, mothers who were in the treatment group were talking more with their child. However, that child was no longer spending much time with the mother because she had another baby, and there you carry that child on your body because it's so vulnerable, and getting that child to live for the first 2 years is the top priority. So this little toddler who now was ready to learn more language more rapidly didn't have that input. So that was the experience in Senegal, and the program we are running now in San Jose is called Habla Conmigo, or Talk With Me, and these are children who will be in the dual language learner category. It's a very large population in California. The demographics of California are going to be the demographics of the United States in 2060. The Latino families and children will be 40%. Of the population of children in this country, definitely the largest ethnic group.
And what are you doing with them?
Many of these children are going to be in ELL classes and are going to be struggling because they're remedial classes and drop out and not graduate and so forth. So it really is a moral obligation as well as an economic one that we help their families, help their children succeed, which they all want to do. They say, we came here so that our child would have more choices than we had, more opportunities than we had, and are very, very eager to learn about the science. Again, we learned from Tostan. You don't preach and prescribe. It's a kind of facilitated discussion. There are 12 workshops a session of 12 workshops that meet, let's say, on Tuesdays for 2 hours. And these are mothers and fathers who do not speak English at all, so they really are the ELL families. And then on Thursdays, and that's content-based. I mean, there's a lot we share the science with them, but draw from their insights and their existing strengths what they think the right application of this science is. Then on Tuesdays, there's a coaching session where the parents and the children are there together. And the wonderful thing and this is a 3-year program, by the way, so that it isn't just one, you have 12 weeks and that's it. We stay with them and help them to meet the developmental challenges a year later, because being responsive to a 6-month-old is a lot of it is physical comfort. Being responsive to a 3-year-old who's coming back at you with language and challenging you and questioning you is quite a different skill set. So we are going to be providing them with with resources to develop.
I've just
these
gotten the
skills.
single signal that we have about 13 minutes left.
Okay.
So I want to make sure we have time for questions. I want to just ask you, rapid fire, starting with Michelle, what's the connection between math and executive function? I know you're on a task force that's exploring that. Each of you, then we're going to go to questions, and then I have one closing question for each of you.
Well, there are several relationships. One of them is that executive function is believed to mediate a really important connection that happens in early childhood in children connecting their intuitive sense of number, quantity, proportions, this nonverbal intuitive sense of mathematics, and the formal system of mathematics that we impose with our cultural invention of numerals and number words and so forth. And so, that's critical for forming an automatic connection between symbols and the intuitiveness of mathematics that we sometimes don't have the tools to convey if we don't master the formal system. So that's one relationship. It's clear that formal mathematics benefits from executive function skills because, think of how Dr. Zalazzo described executive function skills earlier. If you have the cognitive flexibility to consider different approaches to solving a problem, if you have working memory, you can keep track of the steps involved in problem solving while you're engaged in the problem solving. If you are learning a new system, negative numbers, for instance, or multiplication after addition, you have to inhibit a prepotent response of adding numbers and so forth. Now that all applies to formal mathematics, but it also applies to earlier mathematical thinking like counting. When you're counting, you need to keep track of what you're doing. You need to know where you started, where you're ending, and what you're doing to begin with. And then you have to remember you're focusing on this question of how many are there. And all of this requires effortful control. And the attention and effortful control also support learning and expanding mathematics knowledge, which continues throughout the school-age years, not just in kindergarten. And another relationship that is often not attended to, that we are focusing on, the network you referred to, the DREAM network funded by the Heising-Simons Foundation, and that's DREAM spelled D-R-E-M-E, not it's a homonym there. It didn't occur to me until now that DREAM is a homonym, but it stands for Development and Research in Early Math Education. We believe that there's evidence that the relationship between math and executive function is bidirectional, and that by engaging in mathematical thinking, you are naturally engaging in self-reflection, cognitive flexibility, considering different approaches to problem solving, and so getting kids involved in more mathematical thinking may be a way to further enhance the development of their executive function.
And often in interventions, you see that the intervention improves, the executive function intervention improves the child's executive function skills and applied mathematics, for example.
Right.
So you see that. Anna's, what about the
Right,
connection?
and the connection with language is definitely bidirectional. So a child runs out in the street. One response is to grab them and say, "Careful, come back." Another response is to more gently pull the child back and say, "Look, can you see that car coming? If that hit you, it would hurt so bad. Remember when you fell down last week and your arm hurt? It would hurt so bad." In the process of providing an alternative explanation, in the process of encouraging self-regulation through the use of language, you are also using richer vocabulary, you're using more complex syntax, you are stretching and building the language skills of the child at the very same time. Telling stories where you say, what's going to happen next? Is he going to look, is the bird going to be in that hole, or is he going to be hiding somewhere else? And the child has to keep in memory that story that you've read 3 times before, and you're stretching working memory in the process. And also, you're doing something else. You're encouraging another aspect of executive function, which is flexible thinking. Is this going to happen, or is that going to happen? And encouraging the child to reason through language. So language and executive function are really inextricably linked.
And one of the other things that I've seen is that there's, I'm on a task force at the Aspen Institute that's looking at, it started to look at social emotional learning, but it got quickly expanded to be social emotional and academic learning, because this group of scientists have agreed that that you can't really separate out social emotional from cognitive, that when we're learning the brain is networked and those systems are involved. So that's one misconception, but there's a connection between social, emotional, and executive functions at best. One thing I do want to say before we go out to questions is that, and we have time, I think, for two, because I have one last question for all of you. But one thing is that I heard executive functions described as non-cognitive earlier today. No, no, no. If you want to set off my alarm button,
Yes.
say that to me. Everyone at the foundation is so sick of it. Oh, Ellen will just go off if you say that. But these are not non-cognitive. You can hear this. So I hope that you will go back to your communities, and anyone who says non-cognitive, you will say no, no. Or social emotional is different from cognitive learning, no, no. So are there mics, and do we have time for one or two questions? I can't see, so someone's just going to have to speak. We have mics? Someone want to ask a question? Or are we at the end of the day and everybody's eager for cocktail hour?
Thank you so much. This was just a fascinating conversation to listen to. Truly one of the best moments of this entire conference for me. This really isn't just a question, but an opportunity to expand. I might have missed it, but what I didn't hear a lot of was the relationship between attachment theory and executive function and basic attachment and safety. And could you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Sure. Should I
Bill?
say something? Attachment is one of those social and emotional and interpersonal conditions that is important for the healthy development of executive function. Executive function skills, as I suggested, allow the pursuit of goals. So they allow for intentional, goal-directed problem solving, broadly speaking. And that involves an element of agency on the part of the child, and having a kind of secure attachment relation with a parent allows children to extend beyond that relationship and the safety that it provides, and explore and take on new challenges, and then come back to the safety of the attachment relationship. So there's a very close relationship between those two notions, I believe.
Okay, anybody else want the mic? I see him running. I do see that. A blur in the background.
Hi, thank you. I agree. This has been fascinating. Sorry, it's hard to see me over here. I have a question about how executive functioning relates to a lot of the mindset research that's come out. I can't quite figure out if it's a subset of some of the things you're talking about or if it's something different.
I would say it's something different, but it's very compatible with the approach that many people take to executive function these days, insofar as I've been emphasizing, for example, the plasticity of executive function skills, and we know that a growth mindset is more beneficial. And probably I would think of mindset as a kind of motivational frame through which somebody is looking at their own learning and their own development. And it's a motivational frame that is particularly supportive of efforts to practice executive function skills and therefore to develop them.
So I have one closing question for each of you. I'll start with Michelle. If you had one wish to apply what you know to improve the world, each of us has an asset. I hope it's been very, very clear that the curiosity and the passion for learning is so evident in these three scientists, and applying it to the real world is so passionate. That's the incredible asset that you all are bringing. But if you had one wish to make the kind of changes that we want to change, what would you, or to turn this research into action, what would your wish be?
Well, I think that it would be that everyone would recognize that they are a mathematical thinker. And I think that's because this would go so far. I think children aren't doing enough math because adults around them think they aren't mathematical thinkers, and that's silly. I mean, math is in everything we do. Maybe not literally everything, but close to it. And seeing yourself as a mathematical thinker will get adults engaging more in mathematical interactions with children, which will boost their mathematical knowledge and sense. And it will enhance their disposition towards mathematics, recognizing that their effort matters, that their effort makes a difference in what they learn. It will have a positive effect on their attitudes and disposition toward mathematics, which we know has an impact on even young children's developing mathematical thinking. So I think, seeing yourself as a positive mathematical thinker would go a long way in promoting healthy mathematical development in
That's really
students
cool.
and adults.
Anne?
Well, I'm sure share this with most of you, which is that I wish there could be a broad scale effort to provide high quality care, child care to many, many more families, because as it is now, so many working families cannot afford it. It's more than rent. It's the cost of going to a 4-year public college in some 30 states. It's completely unreachable. So that's one goal. And a related goal is to just take seriously the extraordinary skill and talent that is needed in the workforce, and to follow up on this National Academy report on transforming the workforce in early childhood, because that is the future. That is the future, and we need to invest in that and use our science to inspire that investment.
Phil?
I would hope for a broader appreciation among early childhood educators and even parents of the fact that executive function skills and reflection are a foundation for learning other things, crucial skills for being able to succeed and learn in a classroom setting, and that indeed these can be taught. They can be taught in a classroom by intentionally providing children with an opportunity to practice these skills. And if you have children who are able to pay attention and think flexibly and keep information in mind, it's going to be a lot easier to teach them how to do other things, including language and reading and math and so on.
I'm going to give myself one wish, too. My wish is the wish that we have at the Bezos Family Foundation, which is that we create real communities of learners. We have an example of what a difference the kind of learning that these researchers are doing makes in all of our lives, and that we all be ongoing learners, because I think unless the fire is in our eyes, it won't be in our children's eyes as well. And I wish that we begin with the science of learning, that we don't just look at programs that work or don't work, that we really pay attention to what we're learning about learning itself,
Yes.
and use that as the basis for action. So on behalf of my colleagues Marissa and Jackie here, please join us in creating a community of learners. Thank you.